I'm equally delighted to introduce Fabio Sani, who is a professor at the University of Dundee. If you find his accent a bit strange, it's because he was in Devon previously. No one in Devon can speak English properly. Fabio might be described as the Muhammad Ali of social psychology. He floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee. And throughout his career, what he's done is he's taken areas and opened them up. And rather than doing 101 studies on the back of it, he's moved on to another area and opened that up and left it for others then to pick up the trail that he had created. So his early work was on the social psychology of schism, of when groups divide and how they divide and so on. He then moved on to do some really interesting developmental work on the development of social identities. We tend to have Chinese walls in psychology, so we divide developmental psychology from social psychology, and those of us who study group processes and social identities kind of assume that people come out of the womb with these things, and Fabio pointed out probably that's not true, and so how do these develop, and when do they develop, and how do they affect social behaviour? And again, wrote a very influential book, and people are still picking up on the things he started off on. He then moved on to another really interesting idea, which is that of the importance of continuity and historical continuity at a social level. Is it important that we have a sense that the groups we belong to are long-standing? What are the consequences of being ancient? Another issue that nobody had really thought about, which brings together the social, and of course brings together the social with the developmental, because there are personal as well as collective histories, and again opens up all sorts of interesting issues. And the work he's doing now, I think, is another example of taking up a fascinating set of questions which bring together different areas. So increasingly, social psychologists are becoming interested in the relationship between, if you like, the social and the clinical, the social and the medical, the role of our social relationships and group relationships on well-being, not just mental but physical. He's been running a very big project, graciously sponsored by the ESRC, and today we are going to be, I think, the first to hear some of the results which are being analysed, not quite as we speak, because we are speaking, he's not analysing, but have just popped out of the computer. So it really is a pleasure to invite and to hear Fabio speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you for coming today. So as Steve anticipated, today I want to talk to you about the interplay between being involved in group life on the one hand and health, both mental and physical health. And I would like to start by considering a quote, a statement by a very prominent evolutionary biologist. Maybe you have, some of you must have heard of him, and that's Edward Wilson, who is also a fairly controversial figure. But in his last and highly celebrated book, The Conquest of Earth, he made this statement. And actually, most of the book revolves around this idea: to form groups, drawing visceral comfort and pride from familiar fellowship, and to defend the group enthusiastically against rival groups. These are among the absolute universals of human nature and hence of culture. Now, I have shown you this statement because this encapsulates an idea which, as far as I can see, is becoming more and more popular and endorsed, more widely endorsed, within the social and the life sciences in recent times. And the idea basically is that what distinguishes the human species from other animals is the fact of being an intensely social animal, is the fact of being groupist. Okay, this is a term that Wilson, but also, as I said, several other authors, for instance, a primatologist and developmental psychologist like Michael Tomasello is using this term a lot, groupishness, being groupist. So, this idea that we are quintessentially groupist animals. And obviously, a according to this view, we are groupists, first of all, in the sense that we participate into group activities which are based on very high degrees, sophisticated levels of coordination and cooperation. But also, by being groupist, what these people mean is that we experience our membership in groups in very specific ways, and more specifically, we tend to identify subjectively with the social groups to which we belong. We develop a sense of belonging, a sense of affiliation to the groups. We develop a sense of sharing something important in common with other members of an in-group. These can be beliefs, opinions, habits, rituals, norms, a common history, a common project. But the point is that we have this sense that we share something in common, that we are here together. Okay? So this highly symbolic type of attitude toward our groups is believed to be unique to humans. Now, this idea of a subjective sense of belonging to a group and a sense of commonality with other in-group members has been investigated quite in depth by social psychologists adopting a social identity perspective on group processes. Okay? So although these people more or less implicitly accept the idea that the fact that we are members of groups and we invest psychologically in groups is important, they haven't really elaborated the idea in much depth. The social identity researchers have. They've actually investigated group identification, which is how they call this sense of belonging and commonality. They have investigated group identification in depth and its implications. So, although, there are decades of research conducted by social identity researchers on group identification, and therefore it's not easy to summarize what they have found out in their research. Personally, I think that there are two important points that could be mentioned if I wanted to summarize this very large volume of research. First of all, what social identity researchers have demonstrated is that group identification doesn't automatically stem from group membership. So you may be formally a member of a group, nominally you may be part of a group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you identify with the group, that you invest psychologically in the group, that the group is meaningful to you, that you have a sense of us-ness or we-ness. It doesn't come automatically. It is one thing to be a member of a group, it is another to identify with the group. Of course, these two things can go together very often, but it is not necessarily so. And I think this is important. And second, of course, what they've done is to demonstrate that group identification has implications, has consequences, all sorts of consequences. For instance, if one identifies strongly with a group, chances are that this person will be quite committed to the group. Chances are that this person will be prone to be influenced by other members of the group. But there is another implication which I find very interesting and especially intriguing. And the implication is that group identification is linked to health. Okay? It's a proposition which has been made by various prominent social identity people, including Steve here, who has done already some research on group identification and health in his Indian project and also in his BBC prison study, which is probably actually the first study where the link between group identification and health has been investigated. So I find this idea particularly intriguing, and over the last few years, with a number of colleagues at Dundee University, but also outside, I've tried to look into this issue more in depth. Before I start presenting some of the results of my research, though I want to say a little bit more about the link between the nature of the link between group identification and health. Okay? It's obviously a complex link. It's not easy to sort of understand the nature of the causal chain, but maybe a broad model could look like, more or less like this. Okay? Group identification is meant to impact, is believed to impact, first of all, on mental health and psychological processes. For instance, on self-esteem. Because of course, normally if you identify with a group, that implies that you feel accepted by the members of the group, you feel valued by the members of the group, you have a sense that they like you, they share your company, and that obviously has implications for your self-esteem, for self-regard. There may be implications for self-efficacy, because where you are in a group, you normally have a sense that goals and objectives can be achieved more effectively, because of course, there are more people involved into the same task, and so there is more effectiveness. And then, of course, group identification can be seen as being linked to loneliness, because if you are involved in a group, if you are identified with a group, if you feel integrated into a collective, if you feel that you're part of something which somehow transcends your mere individual existence, then presumably that is going to make you feel less lonely, and also presumably less depressed and less anxious. But there is also a link from group identification to behavioral processes. For instance, it is believed that group identification has implications for health behaviors. Okay? And for instance, the fact that you may have a higher self-esteem as resulting from greater group identification may imply that you will take more care of yourself. You will be more careful about what you eat, about exercising. Perhaps you may be more motivated to give up smoking, and so on. Okay? But also, there are specific cases. For instance, I can see when I talk to people, to friends, that people who are very much involved in a family, for instance, and especially if they've got young children, they want to be healthy, they want to be fit, because they want to give a positive contribution to the group. They don't want to be a burden. Okay? So being involved, psychologically investing in a group, may encourage you to adopt a healthier lifestyle. Okay? Or, for instance, if you're a member of a team and you have an injury, I'm mentioning this example because we are doing some research on this topic at the moment. If you're a member of a team and you have got an injury, if you identify strongly with the team, you may be more motivated to adhere to the prescriptions, for medications and everything, because you want to come back and play for the team and give your contribution and be fit and so on. Now, all these factors presumably will have an impact on biological processes, such as the cardiovascular system, the neuroendocrine system, also should have an impact on the immune functions. And of course, these things will impact upon physical health. So that's a general idea. This is a model which is based actually on some theoretical work done by Uccino. He's not a social identity theorist. He's a social epidemiologist who is interested in social ties and health. He's also investigating social ties and health, but the way in which he conceives social ties is not like the way in which we social identity people conceive it. But anyway, so that's based on Uccino. Right, so I think it's about time that I start showing some data. Okay? So our research, when we started our research, we just wanted to sort of get a general idea of the effects of group identification on health. And one of the first studies that we conducted involved almost 500 Spanish people from the area of Valencia. And we basically assessed identification with the family group. We used a well-known validated scale, is the Dosia scale. For those who are into social psychology, maybe they know about the scale. And we assessed the impact of family identification on a number of health outcomes. while controlling for some important variables such as level of education, age, marital status, and an important personality factor, extroversion. Okay, we thought that was important because very often when we discussed about the impact of group identification on health, some people would say, well, actually, don't you think that people who are extroverted, they're more likely to identify with groups? And so, actually, the effect of group identification on health, it might be explained by extroversion. So we wanted to look at that, to assess for that. So these are multiple regressions. Okay, let's see where I can stay. So these are the 5 predictors, as I said, and these are different outcomes that we looked at in different multiple regressions. These are, of course, beta weights, okay, so standardized regression coefficients, and that's the R-squared, indicating the proportional variance explained by the model. Anyway, so these are the outcomes that we looked at, not all of them, but some of them, the ones I thought might be of special interest. So depression, as you can see, there is a negative association there, so greater family identification is associated with lower depression, with less loneliness. This is something that we were curious about, so we just wanted to look at it. It's about the extent to which people will humanize, anthropomorphize their pets. And so basically we gave people a list of adjectives that they could use to describe their pets. Some adjectives were adjectives that you would normally use to describe a pet, such as agile or strong, mainly regarding physical features. But some of them were really human traits, such as sympathetic, thoughtful, And what we found was that people who were less identified with the family were more inclined to define their pets using human terms. Okay? They anthropomorphized their pets, okay? Which we thought it was intriguing. We thought it was fascinating because if you're disconnected from human beings, maybe you will sort of turn your pet into human beings. This is not to say that they love their pets more than other people. Okay? What I'm saying is that they sort of perceive their pets maybe more humanly. And then there was a association with general health. That was a self-reported general health, positive association, so greater family identification, greater perceived general health. And also we assessed pain, different sorts of pains. I report only back pain here, but we also assessed neck pain, headache, various types of pain, because normally pain is associated with depression and loneliness. And so we were curious about that as well. And we did find an association between greater group identification and less pain. For instance, with back pain, the beta was minus 0.25. So that study and a series of other similar studies gave us the sense of the link between group identification and health, gave us the confidence to go on and to explore the issue further, because it was obvious to us that there was a link. There was indeed a link between group identification and health. At this point, there was another issue that we started sort of, worrying about. Because as I said before, as I mentioned briefly before, social identity researchers are not the only ones who have done research on the link between social ties and health. Social epidemiologists have studied this link for decades. And they found results which are not too different from ours. However, social epidemiologists conceptualize, they operationalize the idea of social integration in different ways. They basically understand social ties and social links in terms of the frequency of interaction with others, the extent to which you have personal contact with other members of the group. For instance, if you take the very popular, very well-known, deservedly so, study by Cohen and colleagues about the cold, about the link between social networks and the probabilities of developing a cold, if you look at the way in which Cohen measured social network, so the social network indexes he used, was based on items such as, how often do you talk to the members of your family? How often have you spoken to a member of your family over the last 2 weeks, face to face or via telephone? So there is this idea that being integrated into a group is about having an intensive level of contact with the members of the group. And we thought, well, what if when we measure group identification, what we are doing is actually dealing with some sort of epiphenomenon? So basically, is it possible that actually group identification stems from contact? But maybe if we include contact in our equations, maybe the effect of group identification will disappear. We thought that wouldn't be the case, but because we were convinced that group identification has effects on health which are independent from the effects of contact. But we still wanted to look at it. Okay? Now, in order to sort of emphasize even more the difference between contact and group identification, allow me to give you some examples taken from my own experience. Okay? So I think one of you in the audience here will immediately recognize these people. Okay. We have a table tennis player here, and Ian Smith from economics. So these are the Barons. Okay? This is a table tennis team I've been a member of for several years. And I can tell you I'm strongly identified with the team. I have a clear sense of belonging, affiliation, loyalty to the team. Certainly I have a sense of commonality. I share things in common with David and Derek. A passion for the game, an ethos, a sense of commitment and so on. So there is group identification there, no doubts. But concerning contact, yeah, I see them reasonably often, a couple of times a week. One day for the game, another day for the training. But then, of course, over summer, I don't see them. When I'm on holiday, I don't see them. So there is some contact, but not a huge amount of contact. Nonetheless, there is great identification. This is another situation instead, okay? This is the 34th Infantry Battalion of the Italian Army. We are back in 1980, okay? And that is me. Okay? As you can see from my facial expression, I wasn't too happy to be there. Okay? Military service was compulsory at the time in Italy. I didn't have a choice. Okay? I had to go through that. Okay? I hadn't signed up for that. Now, concerning identification, my degree of identification with the Army was 0. Okay? I couldn't care less about the Army. I didn't want to be there. I didn't have a sense of belonging. Not that I've got anything in principle against it. I just didn't want to be there. I just didn't have a sense I didn't belong. Okay? So I didn't have a sense of affiliation. I didn't have a sense of being part of it. Certainly, I didn't have a sense of sharing something in common with other soldiers, especially those who were the people who were higher up in the hierarchy in terms of values, in terms of beliefs, and so on. So no identification, but contact. I don't think I've had ever such an intensive contact in my life with other people. For a year, I was with these people every single day, 10, 12, 14 hours per day, doing things with them. Training, marching, running, shooting, throwing bombs, everything, you name it. We were always together. There was a lot of contact. There was no identification. So I'm saying this because I want to convey this idea clearly. You may be a member of a group, but there is contact on the one hand, and there is identification on the other hand. These things may be, to some extent, associated, but I do believe that they are largely independent. And the data that we collected confirmed that. So this is a study, again, using the family group, in which we measured social contact. So basically we asked people, how often do you talk to members of your family? Face-to-face, over email, over telephone? How many family-related activities do you take part on average, in an average month, and so on? So we had several items assessing contact. And what we found was that while family identification had a strong negative impact on depression and on stress, and a strong positive impact on life satisfaction, social contact didn't have so much impact. Okay? So yes, more social contact was related with lower depression and lower stress and more satisfaction with life, but the size of the effects was much smaller than the size of the effects of group identification. This was a sample of Polish people. Also, we did a study with an army unit in an Eastern European country. Okay, I cannot specify the country because they don't want me to, but it's in Eastern Europe. Okay? So it's an army unit, 150 members of an army unit. We measured army identification, social contact again, and in terms of status, we assessed rank and age as well. But again, army identification was negatively related with depression and positively related with life satisfaction, but social contact had basically no relationship at all with mental health. Not at all. I thought that was intriguing actually because again, in the army, these are actually professionals. And you would expect that spending more time with your with the other members of the army, would reinforce your sense of identification, but it didn't. This is another study. This is to do with people with multiple sclerosis who take part in support groups. Obviously, because all these people take part in the same support groups, they all have an equal level of contact with other members of the support group. Okay? However, while identification with the support group leads to lower depression and lower anxiety and higher life satisfaction, okay? Well, we don't have a measure of social contact, but obviously, if contact was important there, then presumably, group identification might not have that impact. But although these people have the same amount of contact with one another, group identification still plays an important part. Okay, at this point, we thought it was time to embark in a project of a larger scale. So we wanted to do something bigger, to test more people. We also wanted to use objective measures of health because in all the studies that I have presented so far, the health measures were self-reported, so we wanted to see what would happen if actually we used objective measures. We also wanted to assess multiple group identifications to see whether every additional identification would sort of bring further gains in terms of health. And so we began this project, cross-national and longitudinal project. Today I'm going to show you only cross-sectional data because we have only done wave 1 so far. Wave 2 is going to be done in about a year time. Okay? So, but the project is longitudinal, and it is cross-national because it involves Scottish people as well as Italian people, but I'm going to present only data from Scottish people because the Italians have been a little bit slow with data entry and they haven't finished yet. Okay? And despite a strong effort done by Lucia, who is trying to push our Italian colleagues to finish the data entry, they're a little bit slow. Okay? Today I want to present you some of the preliminary results. And before presenting you the results of the relationships between group identification and health outcomes, let me tell you something about the characteristics of the sample because I think it is relevant, okay? So first of all, this is the characteristics of the sample in terms of high group identifications. Maybe I should say that what we have done here is to assess 3 groups, identification with 3 groups: the family, the local community, and then a third group that the participants would choose from a list. Okay, so it could be a leisure group, it could be at the workplace, it could be a group of friends, it could be a sport team, it could be any group to which the participant feels he or she is a member of. And then we have dichotomized the score on identification with each group, so that people above a certain threshold have been assigned to the category high identifiers, and the other people are in the category of those who do not identify highly. So clearly, you may end up here, when you add up the high identifications, with a score ranging from 0 to 3. So you've got 3 groups, you may identify highly with none of the groups, or with 1, 2, or 3 groups. Is that clear, yeah? So this is the number of high identifications, frequency and percentage. So a small percentage of people, about 5%, identify with no group at all, which makes me feel that these people are fairly isolated psychologically. Then there is 17% of people identifying with one group, 32% identifying with 2 groups, and 44%, the largest group, but a bit less than half of the sample, identifying with 3 groups. Also, I want to show you some descriptive data concerning some of the main health outcomes that we have used, because I think that's relevant, that's important. Okay? This is to do with the body mass index. Okay? We have measured the body mass index, and we have classified people in terms of BMI as either obese. These are the people with a BMI which is equal or above 30, okay, following the recommendations of health authorities. And of course, non-obese people are those with a BMI below 30. And what concerning our sample, we have 28% of women as well as 28% of men who are obese in our sample. I think this is relevant because if you look at the national situation, the percentage of people who are obese in Scotland is almost the same, 27%. So I think this is interesting because although our sample is a convenience sample, okay, this is people, we have used patients in practices which have accepted to participate in the study. Nonetheless, we believe that our sample is reasonably representative of the Scottish population overall. Okay? So these are the people who are obese, and these are the people who are overweight. So the people who have a BMI above 25. Okay? And these are the people who have got a BMI above 30, okay? From 1995 to 2012. So these are the most recent data. These are data concerning antidepressants. Okay? So we have assessed, we have checked whether people are or are not on antidepressants. These are not self-reported data. We have just checked the medical record of these people, okay, of our participants. We've got 12.3% of women on antidepressants among our participants and 6.9 men on antidepressants. The total is 10% of people on antidepressants. Is 1 out of 10. And yeah, I can see some of you going like, that's a lot. Okay, that was my reaction as well. But actually, if you look at the national statistics, it's not a lot. It's exactly the same. Actually, at the national level, the estimation is 10.4% on antidepressants in Scotland at the moment. So again, our sample, the characteristics of our sample seems to be matching quite closely the characteristics of the Scottish population as a whole. Okay. Does this make sense? Yeah. So these are the different types of antidepressants prescribed. These are, for instance, the SSRIs, clearly the type of antidepressants which are more often prescribed, and then other types, but that's the total. Okay? From 2001 to 2010, you can see a strong increase in prescriptions of antidepressants, a trend that epidemiologists are well aware of. Anyway, so we've got a sample which, as I said, is a convenience sample, but we believe to be reasonably representative of Scotland. So the results that I'm going to show you, we believe that could be found in the Scottish population as a whole. Okay, so we start with health behaviors, lifestyle. So these are the number of group identifications, 0, 1, 2, and 3. And this is the association with exercise, whether or not people exercise once a week, at least. So we've got yes and no. The healthy diet, whether or not people eat 3 or more portions of vegetables and fruit per day. This is smoking, yes or no, and this is heavy drinking, whether or not people drink more than 22 units per week if they're women, or 29 units per week if they are men. As you can see, the unhealthy option in each column is typically chosen more often by people with a lower number of identifications. So concerning exercise, okay, there are only 7% of people among those with 3 identifications which do not exercise at all. The number goes up to 28% among those with no identifications. We are talking about 4 times as much. Concerning healthy diets, 70% of 18% of those with 3 identifications do not reach 3 portions per day of fruit and vegetables, but 44% of those without identifications do not reach that. Okay? Smoking, 71% of people with 3 identifications smoke, 23% of those with 3 identifications smoke. And heavy drinking, 2.6% of those with 3 identifications drinks heavily, 7.5% of those with 3 identifications drinks heavily. So, and look at the gradient. I think that's interesting as well. So you go from, for instance, concerning exercise, 7%, 11, 16, 28. There is a clear gradient on each variable. Okay? Concerning smoking, 7, 9, 13, 23. Although a big jump can be observed when people move from 0 identifications to 1, as if having 1 identification already was to some extent beneficial, very beneficial to health. But for each additional identification, there are more benefits. These are the data concerning obesity. 32% of people with 3 identifications appear to be obese. 63% of those with 0 identification. So again, twice as many. So clearly, the number of group identifications impact upon our BMI as well, in a clear fashion. We also did, of course, these are cross-tabular data. It's a non-parametric statistical analysis. We also looked at the impact of high group identifications on health behaviors or obesity while controlling for other important variables. Okay? So for instance, these are the data for obesity. Okay? This is logistic regression. Maybe some of you may not be familiar with that because this is a technique which psychologists do not use very much. So it's the sort of regression that you do when you've got categorical outcomes instead of outcomes measured on a continuous variable. Okay? And without getting into the details of these figures, in case you're not familiar with, you can just focus on the sign here of the B, of the coefficient. As you can see, even though you are controlling here for the effects of education, gender, age, whether a person is in a relationship or not, we are controlling for contact with groups. Despite the fact that we are controlling for all these variables, group identifications, the number of group identifications, still impact strongly on obesity. Okay? More group identifications, less obesity. Okay? For those who are familiar with the notion of odds ratios, then of course, I think that these figures here should be should be telling concerning the impact of group identifications. Now we move to mental health. Depression. We used two indicators. One indicator is a self-rated depression. We used the major depression inventory, okay, which is a measure I like because it's not too long, it's not too taxing, and the items are closely based on the symptoms for depression, which are taken into account in ICD-10. Okay? And so we use the MDI, and an MDI value on the major depression inventory equal or above 26 is considered to indicate a clinical level of depression. And then we obviously, as I said before, we checked the medical record of our participants looking for whether or not they were on antidepressants. Now, the data for the self-rated depression are striking, okay? Very, very strong. So basically, people with 3 identifications, less than 1% of them appear to be clinically depressed. Among the people with 0 identifications, 30% of them, we are talking about 30 times, is more likely to be depressed if you are isolated than if you are well integrated. That's self-reported, of course, so we have to take into account all sorts of possible biases. For instance, there are people who get a very high score on self-rated depression, but actually maybe they are going through problems which are objectively stressful, some sort of loss. And so, these days there is a tendency not to classify these people as depressed, but as people who are reacting in a normal way to adversities. So, it might be that many of these people are actually not clinically depressed, but still the impact is very strong. And the impact is strong even on antidepressants. So among the people with 3 identifications, 7% of them is on antidepressants, but among the people with 0 identifications, 20% of them are on antidepressants. We are talking about 3 times as much. And again, if we do a logistic regression in which we control for the impact of in which we assess the impact of group identifications on depression while controlling for important variables such as education, gender, age, and so on, the effects are still there and they're still strong. So clearly the effects of group identifications are independent from several other important variables which are known to some extent, impact upon depression. Okay. So these are the results for antidepressants. Right. Now, following the analysis of the study, actually following the creation of this project, we also put together another project, which is conducted by one of my PhD students, Kerstin Miller, assessing similar links with children. So basically, we wanted to know whether these effects would replicate with adolescents. And so we tested a number of adolescents in high schools in Scotland. So its number is around 1,100 participants. Okay. What we found were interesting results again. These are the findings for health behaviors, specifically the findings concerning smoking. So as you can see, this is whether or not they smoke cigarettes or cannabis as a function of the number of high group identifications. As you can see, for instance, concerning smoking cannabis, 2.7% of those with 3 identifications said they do. 13% of those with no identifications reported smoking cannabis. Similar results were found, proportionally similar results were found with concern to smoking. These are the results for health. Again, we've got several variables. I just don't want to bore you with a lot of tables. So I just included two of these variables. One is psychological distress as measured with the GHQ, which is a fairly popular measure of general mental well-being. And this is a measure of bodily pain. So basically we asked the children how often they were unable to go to school because they were in pain, some sort of pain. And again, as you can see, the more group identifications they have, the less likely they are to be in psychological distress, and the less likely they are to be in pain. So results are very similar for children, for adolescents. These are children whose age is ranging from 13 to 17 years. Okay? So as I said, around 1,100 participants in the study. Okay, now, obviously all the data which I've shown so far are cross-sectional data. So they don't say much about the causal chain. Okay? I believe these are still interesting data anyway, because the links are so strong that, in my opinion, they show that this phenomenon, this link between group identifications and health, deserves to be investigated in real depth. However, of course, as I said, these data don't say much about the causal chain, so it is perfectly possible, as I actually speculated in the model which I showed you at the beginning of the talk, it is perfectly possible that not only group identification impacts upon health, but it is possible that health impacts upon group identification. If you feel unwell, if you feel down, if you feel in a bad mood, if you feel sad, presumably you don't have the energy to go out and feel involved in group life. Okay? So probably there is a two-way traffic. But it's going to be interesting to investigate the nature of these links more in depth. And obviously, we hope that when we collect data from wave 2, we will be in a position of making some informed speculations about the direction of the effects. But in the meanwhile, we have done a relatively small study, longitudinal study, looking at the link between family identification and self-rated general health in a sample of Spanish students. And this is a summary of the results. This is a cross-lagged panel model. Okay? As you can see, these are the measures of health, general health, and family identification at time 1. And these are the same measures taken about 8-10 months later, at time 2. And these are the various paths. So as you can see, family identification time 1 has got a statistically significant impact on health at time 2. On the other hand, health time 1 doesn't impact significantly on family identification at time 2. So there are some effects. And I don't think these are negligible, although they are not statistically significant, but in terms of size, it's not a tiny size. However, obviously these effects are stronger and statistically significant. So these findings have to be taken with some caution. It's only one study. Sample is not tiny, but not very large either, 216. These are students, a very specific type of sample. So we need to take these results with some caution, but what they seem to point at is the fact that maybe group identification impacts over time on health, while health doesn't have a very strong effect on group identification over time. Okay, so I think it's about time that I wrap it up what I've said very quickly. So basically, I've presented research which I believe demonstrates that there is a link between group identification and health. The link is, in some cases, remarkable, in some cases is not too strong. More generally, I sense that the link with mental health is much stronger than the link with physical health. And so certainly the link between group identifications and mental health deserves to be investigated more in depth. and more carefully. And also, I believe that our data demonstrate quite clearly that group identification is important above and beyond the degree to which people interact with other members of the group. It is not contact, which may lead or may not lead to better health. It is group identification. Is it perfectly possible, of course, that if you identify with a group, you want to be more in contact with the members of the group? And that maybe explains the positive association between these two variables. But this positive association is not strong at all. And the effects on health of these two variables are clearly independent. I think I will stop here before actually I completely shut up. Okay? I want to make some acknowledgments. First of all, ESRC, because they've been very generous in terms of the grant that they have given to us in order to do the longitudinal research. But I'm also very, very grateful, sincerely grateful to my colleagues and students, because they've been wonderful in terms of the help, in terms of the extent to which they've been involved in the research. So this is Juliet Wickfield. She's the postdoctoral research assistant employed in the ESRC project. Mike Norbury and Vishnu Maddock are the co-applicants in the project. They are medical doctors. They've been very, very important in terms of developing the objective measures and various other aspects of the project. Pat Dugard, our statistician, with which we consult very often, especially myself, because my statistical understanding is not amazing, despite having written a book. And so some people think I play the modest person, but actually it's the truth. I don't know that much about statistics. I think I know something about the basics, but when we get into sophisticated stuff, I easily get lost. And Pat Dugard she's a wonderful statistician with a PhD in statistics from Cambridge. She's really brainy, and her contribution here is invaluable. And then my two current PhD students, Kirsty Miller, the one who is conducting the research on the children, and Samantha Schwarzbank, who is doing research on the impact of group identification on post-traumatic stress among cancer survivors. Beautiful research involving more than 1,000 cancer survivors. I'm pretty sure that the results of this research are going to be very interesting. And Marina Herrera is our Spanish colleague, so the person has been involved in the studies which I have presented using a Spanish sample. Okay? And if you invite me again next time, I will present the Italian data, and that will give me an opportunity to thank Lucia Botindari as well, who is here, who is working very hard on the Italian part of the project. Okay, so that was really all. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
This is not to imply that you're a mug for coming here, but it is to present you with this wonderful person.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.